Boy, I'm really torn. I want to talk about both Cuba and South Africa today, both of which are of particular interest to me. Being from Florida, everyone knows that we have a large, Cuban expat turned Cuban American population in this state. There was long economic ties between Florida and Cuba dating back before the birth of the Castro regime. But South Africa too has there's a lot of ties here. I've been watching the slow motion collapse of South Africa for much of my life. I've known a lot of expatriates from Rhodesia slash Zimbabwe and as well as South Africa. Florida, other than Australia, I would say Florida is probably would be the number one destination for people looking to flee those two countries because of our more similar climate. Of course, SA and Zimbabwe are much drier, but I'll save that. I think I'll talk about that tomorrow and focus on Cuba for today because I think that is of a more immediate concern to Americans because I will say something positive first before I get into the negative. It's a good thing to see folks in Cuba rising up against the former Castro regime. Castro's dead and his brother's retired, so it's hard to call it the Castro regime anymore. We'll just call it the communist regime. The current guy who took over after Raul Castro stepped down, his name's Diaz-Canal. Slick-looking dude. Much younger. I mean, he still has gray hair. He's not too young, but he's the freshest face that they've had in decades in Cuba. And despite that, folks are up in arms, out in the streets, rising up against him. And make no mistake, Cuba is a bad place. Their government, not friendly. A lot of these folks are going to be swept up by the police and renditioned away to camps or prisons. Cuba's not a nice place for political dissidents. But with that said, I want to get all that out of the way because you're going to hear a lot about that coming up this week. We've heard a lot about it again for our entire lives in the United States, especially if you're from Florida like I am. A lot of people who have been personally affected by the evils of that regime, who have lost property, who have lost livelihoods, whose family, parts of their family still trapped over there. But with all that said, given the nature of what's going on over there and what is being said about it here in the United States, I need to take a step back, put my personal emotions aside, put my personal feelings aside, and look at this a bit more objectively. And, there is a decent chance that there is some truth to what Diaz-Canal is saying in response by, I don't think he used the term color revolution. I don't know if that term exists in the Spanish language, or if they call it something else, but he essentially blamed all the protests and rioting. I'm not sure if it's devolved much into riots. I haven't seen videos of them being violent, but of course, the anti-Castro folks outside of Cuba are not going to be retweeting videos of protesters committing acts of violence. So I don't know. I'll just say protests because that's all I've seen evidence of. Diaz-Canal says these are all trumped up by the U.S. The U.S. is behind them. It's pure agitation. Whether that's the CIA, the NED, or some other intel agency. And to be honest, we don't find out about these things until years later. And it is the same formula that's been followed going all the way back to Iran in 1950. Oh, gee, I forgot. Was it 1952? 1954? I can't remember. When they reinstalled the Shah as a more absolute monarch back in the 50s in Iran. There was the coup against Salvador Allende in Chile, which was very similar. People rising up in the streets demanding, hey, end of the regime. Both of these are early examples of revolutions that were backed and organized by the CIA. The first one was against a more secular nationalist leader The second one was against a friend of Castro, a personal friend of Castro's, which is interesting in this case. And and since then, we've seen a lot of them, especially since the end of the Cold War. We saw the first real color revolution in Serbia, staged against Milosevic. We saw the Orange Revolution against, gosh, I can't even remember the guy's name. One of the old Ukrainian, pro-Russia guys was overthrown in a coup. Then they had the Maidan Revolution against Yanukovych, very similar to this sort of thing. There was I can't remember the color. There was the revolution in Georgia that was organized by the U.S. And they all have a very similar character to this. Now, does that mean that the U.S. is behind this just because it's their MO? No. There are plenty of cases of revolutions like this occurring spontaneously. The Yellow Vests in France, for example. The U.S. was not behind the Yellow Vests. The U.S. did not like the Yellow Vests. If you notice, there was very little coverage of the Yellow Vests in American media or Western media in general. There was also, and then actually, I was going to just cite the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, but to be honest, I don't know that the CIA didn't have any role in that. They might have, actually, because, that was against Assad. So it's hard for me. I'm going to stop there. So for right now, the only revolution of this style that I can think of off the top of my head, I thought there was another example that I had, is the Yellow Vests, which, of course, the Yellow Vests were unsuccessful. But, just about every other revolution like this where people get up in the streets and they're mad and it's spontaneous and it's all of a sudden and you just see people flooding the streets. If they're successful, odds are they were backed by the CIA. Now, that doesn't mean that these folks are just plain old American puppets. That doesn't mean that they don't have legitimate grievances, obviously. Even if I knew that the CIA was organizing this, if I lived over in Cuba, I would probably be joining these folks out in the streets because I don't like my government. Just because the CIA doesn't like a certain government doesn't mean that that's a good government and that you should be in support of it. Now, if it was just that, I would not be too concerned. Because you would expect the U.S. intelligence folks, if there was an uprising like this in a country that the U.S. doesn't like, the U.S. is going to do what they can to try and promote the side of the opposition. There was that failed coup back in Venezuela that just didn't have enough popular support, and so they were unable, or they were unsuccessful in their color revolution, and it was too astroturfed. It was pretty much just U.S. interests that were backing it, and there wasn't a lot of support for it domestically. And frankly, from what I understand in the history of Cuba, that's been the case in Cuba for decades. The U.S. would have overthrown Castro many, many times. They would have overthrown him during his own lifetime if they could have. They were just unable. And so one knock against this being an American coup going on right now in Cuba is that the Americans have tried for decades to overthrow the Cuban government, and they've been unable to do so. And so if it's finally, happening, odds are it's not the Americans who are doing it, because the Americans would have already done it if they could. That, to me, lends credibility to the idea that this is truly spontaneous and organic. Now, another alternative that kind of splits the baby down the middle is that the U.S. has been trying to make something like this happen for decades, yes, but there hasn't been enough organic energy behind such a movement for the U.S. to really get it off the ground. And now people are mad enough to rise up against the Castros, and they're being aided by the CIA and by or the NED, which is a CIA cutout, and who knows who else in the U.S. intelligence world. All of these are possibilities that must be considered, and you can't just dismiss them offhand because, past performance is not indicative of future results, but, pattern detection is a basic human instinct. And gee, I can't believe I went 10 minutes on that. But moving on to what I consider to be the scariest thing to come out of this weekend. Mayor Suarez of Miami, I can't remember his first name. It's It's not Antonio. Gee, I won't think of it. It's not Mario. It's something else. But anyway, Mayor Suarez, he's this young, clean-cut, slick guy. He's very tech-savvy. He has a pretty good Twitter game. I think he's a fan of crypto. Kind of reminds me of the president of Nicaragua. Or was it El Salvador? The guy who just made Bitcoin legal tender. Kind of gives me similar vibes to him. And to be honest, I've not been a fan of Suarez. First of all, he buys billboards in California urging big tech to move to Florida. I don't like that. I don't want big tech's money here. I don't want big tech's voters here. He's an idiot politically if he wants those people to move to his city, because they will vote him out of office. If you move a bunch of tech companies and all of their employees to Miami, they're not going to be electing Republican mayors. No matter how cool and hip you think you are, Mayor Suarez, party loyalty trumps all of that. And second of all, he's a pretty typical corporatist Republican who likes to cut deals and get things done, and have the government involved in the market and such. He's not a capitalist, let's say. He's a guy who likes to make money. We'll put it that way. He doesn't really care about markets or that much liberty. He doesn't like communists, certainly. He hates the communists, and I'll get into that in a second. But that doesn't mean that he's Mr. Pro-freedom, He doesn't believe in total competition. He doesn't think, hey, let the best, may the best man win. Let the best business succeed. He likes cutting backroom deals as mayor. He likes to incentivize companies to move to his city by giving them huge tax breaks to try and subsidize them moving to his city, and while taxing everyone who's already here, at the same rates, which is clearly unfair. And so that brings me to his statements over this weekend, which are quite troubling, quite frightening, in which he is imploring President Biden to send troops to Miami to occupy the country and to, I guess, assist in the revolution against the regime in Havana. And obviously, if the U.S. did send troops to Cuba to overthrow their government, I think that would be making it a little too obvious that the U.S. is behind this revolution, because quite literally then they would be behind them, backing them up, providing them, with military aid. And, that to me, I guess it can't be as disastrous as Iraq or Afghanistan. I'll give them that. But it's never going to be a good idea. It's not going to work out well in the end. I don't know how a war with Cuba, or a war in Cuba, more specifically, which the U.S. did fight a war in Cuba back in 1898, went pretty well for a while, although eventually that led to the rise of Castro. There is a decent risk, I think, that the U.S. would be not welcomed as liberators, but rather opposed as conquerors if they tried to intervene in Cuba's domestic politics. And that would have the effect of discrediting anti-regime forces, forces is the wrong word, anti-regime sentiments. Anyone who's opposed to the regime would then be, viewed as an American shill, which that stigma already exists. That has been the cudgel, that has been the club that the regime has used against any dissidents over the past few decades, since, 1959, when they took over. They just beat people over the head with it and said, anyone who opposes me is an American shill. And by disagreeing with Fidel Castro, you are a traitor to your country, because if you don't like Fidel, well, you must love the CIA. And so I think that the best thing for the folks in Cuba, in order to prevent a situation, in order to prevent the rise of a regime like Castro's again, or the rise of a regime like Batista's, who of course was backed by the United States and was in his own way a bad dictator, though I think objectively not nearly as bad as Fidel Castro. would be for the Cuban people to take the third option of saying, hey, you know what? We don't like communism and Castro, but we also don't want to be dominated by the United States. We want to just manage our own affairs and do what we want and run our own country. You know, I can already see it now. If the U.S. were to invade Cuba, I think their government would fall fairly quickly, and, you know, they'd run off into the hills, kind of like Castro did initially, as he, you know, bided his time, waiting for his chance to overthrow the U.S.-backed regime. And there would probably be an ongoing insurgency in the country. But then again, you know, Cuba is an island. It's only so big. That insurgency probably would be defeated in time, but again, that's a big if. There are, I think, still a lot of jungles on Cuba that folks could hide out in, just like Castro and Rafael Cruz and Che Guevara did way back when. But even if the insurgents were defeated, I can already see the new ruling class, who would likely be the wealthy Cuban-American community, who has, you know, succeeded quite a lot, you know, quite well in this country since they first came here after the Cuban Revolution in the, you know, late 50s through the 80s, and I guess all the way up through the present. There's still folks who, you know, who make it here from Cuba, and many of them would go back to the country. They'd invest. They would, you know, build up the economy. And they'd likely own most of the country. They would be the most powerful players in domestic politics, and I think that the Cubans who lived on that island this entire time, who didn't run off to America and make lots of money, likely would resent the Cuban American folks who repatriate themselves and would not be welcomed, I think, so openly as the new ruling class. And the American intervention would be seen as a turning point in which that ruling class was installed. I think that I can very easily see that narrative being painted, whereas it's harder to do that if the government falls on its own, if the people who are there now overthrow the government and then, you know, welcome back the Cuban-American expats. I think that there will be a lot more bad blood if the U.S. uses its own outside force to overthrow this current very bad, no good, very bad regime. Also, you know, in a purely selfish way, it might be bad from a domestic politics perspective, because if Cuba is, you know, liberated from the communist regime, then there's a whole lot of these, you know, successful Cuban Americans who largely vote Republican that might be compelled to move back to Cuba and would no longer be voting in U.S. elections. They wouldn't be voting in local elections here in you know, either in Miami or Florida in general. And, you know, that might be a big political blow. I mean, you never know. Florida historically has been pretty close politically, swinging one way or the other. And, you know, in most elections that the Republicans win, which again, I don't think Republicans are great, but I prefer them over Democrats, particularly in this state. If you take the Cuban vote out of the equation, or if you minimize the Cuban vote, the Republicans would not have won a lot of these elections. I mean, certainly Trump's big victory here in 2020 is almost entirely, well, I shouldn't say it's all due to Cubans, but it's, you know, it's pretty much all due to Dade County. That's the only place where he improved in the state. You know, a lot of that was not just Cubans gaining, you know, supporting Trump more than they did in 2016, but it was also Venezuelans and other folks down there. But anyway, I mean, that's a relatively minor issue compared to, you know, the issue of Cuba itself and what the future would look like, what the implications long-term of a U.S. intervention there would be. I mean, you have to remember that the early Cuban Americans, the folks who moved here initially after Castro took over, were the folks who benefited the most from the Batista regime. That's why they left immediately. A lot of the folks who came later were folks who opposed Batista and had hopes for Castro, and then he eventually disappointed them. But the core really of the that seeded the Cuban American community in Florida was were upper middle class folks who would be natural elites in a new post-communist Cuban society. I think that the Cuban American population in a post-communist Cuba would be akin to the Americo-Liberian population, which ruled over Liberia until, well, a few decades ago. Americo-Liberians were, of course, former slaves who were liberated in the United States, and they went off to found the country of Liberia in West Africa, and they became the new ruling class and controlled that government and based it around the United States government. And were essentially Americans living in Africa, ruling over African tribesmen. And those differences were a big deal in Liberia, and a lot of the natives of the country who were not former slaves from the United States and were not descended from former slaves in the United States resented the Americo-Liberians. And now Americo-Liberians are almost an extinct ethnic group. They certainly have no political power in Liberia anymore. The American symbols in Liberia are, vestigial organs, essentially. There are some old rotting buildings that look very American. They have there's this one building you always see pictures of that's, I think it was a Masonic hall in Monrovia. And Cuba's been through this before because the original, Republic of Cuba, founded in 1898 or 1899, thereabouts, was meant, like Liberia, to be a little America. And the people who founded it were, they based, look at their Capitol building. It looks like the U.S. Capitol. And eventually, Cuba rejected that American lineage in their government. And I think that's the result of using force to impose these sorts of things. I think that it ends badly. It ends with a backlash. And this last backlash against American influence in Cuba resulted in decades of communism. So I think we need to think a little more clearly before we try and use American military power to overthrow a regime in Cuba. Because if you think about it, think about how bad the original regime that the U.S. overthrew in Cuba was. It was the Spanish Empire. And you can say, well, the Republic of Cuba that the Americans created was a better government than the Spanish Empire. But that American regime in Cuba resulted in Castro's regime. And so you have to look at it as, yes, the U.S. overthrew the Spanish Empire, but that resulted eventually in Castro. And so wouldn't you say, gee, it would have been better if the Americans just left the Spaniards in charge of Cuba? Wouldn't that have been better off for everybody? And so I fear what overthrowing this communist regime might eventually lead to. It could lead to something even worse, because that's been the history in Cuba so far. That's what happened last time the Americans overthrew their regime. Of course, the Americans did quite a few coups in Cuba. I think they did a coup back in 1917 because the current president didn't want to go to war with Germany, didn't want to declare war on Germany in World War I when the U.S. did it. They did a coup over that. So that about sums up my thoughts. I will continue to monitor this very closely. I'm going to try and get to the topic of South Africa here soon, but we'll see. So with that said, I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.